All right, so I will call to order the second monthly meeting of the Hendersonville City Council, September 27th, 2023. Councilmember Hensley is not here. She had a family obligation. First thing we have is consideration of the agenda. Is anything anyone would like to have moved, removed from or added to the agenda this evening, or a motion to approve as presented?
Madam Mayor, I move that the City Council approve the consent agenda as presented.
Okay. Is there any discussion? Actually, we were just at consideration of the agenda. We'll get to the consent agenda.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
That's all right. So it is moved to approve the agenda. Is it, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. Ayes have it. We have our agenda for this evening. Next, we have the consent agenda. Is there anything anyone would like to have moved from the consent agenda to the regular agenda so it can be discussed? Or a motion to approve?
Madam Mayor, I move that City Council approve the consent agenda as presented.
Okay, thank you. Is there any discussion? Not. Those in favor of the consent agenda as presented say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. Ayes have it, and we have that. All right, right into our presentation. Mr. Conant, you going to introduce this?
Yes, Mayor Vogt, members of City Council. Before I do that, just let the City Council know that City Attorney Beaker is available on Zoom, so she's here. So if we need her, we can unmute her. And Angie, if you feel like you need to jump in anytime, just raise your hand and we'll keep our eye out for you there. So I'd like to introduce Chief Myhan, who will introduce our distinguished guest as it relates to the K-9 assessment report, and I'll talk a little bit more as we get to the end of the report. So, Chief.
All right, good afternoon, Madam Mayor and Council. I'm Blair Myhan, your police chief. I'm gonna do my hair while I'm waiting for the thing to be pulled up there. You never know when it gets a little wild.
Got you. I feel your pain, bro. I got you.
Yeah. So tonight, myself and my counterparts here are going to go over the K-9 assessment that the city hired the North Carolina Association of Chiefs of Police to do a few months ago, and give you an overview of that and give the public who's watching an opportunity to see that report. So the incident that brought this whole thing to light happened in August 2nd of 2020, where one of our police dogs attacked a neighbor, a man who lived next door to the officer who was the handler, and he caused very significant injuries that resulted in us being sued 2 years following this incident, and ultimately a settlement of $1.75 million that we paid largely through our insurer. So that is the incident that it caused all of this, and so we want to go into our assessment, why we want to do that. You know, I think for us, we really I want to be, the manager wants us to be very accountable for our actions on that day. We want to really be transparent. This is difficult for us to come up and admit our faults that day. You know, that's sort of I think a human nature to sort of not admit your faults, so you can be somewhat insulated from that. But we want to make sure that we are always improving. That's a philosophy that the city has. That's a philosophy that I have personally, you know, as the police chief. And of course, when John and I have talked, this is something that is very important for our agency moving forward. And ultimately, this is a public trust issue where, you know, we made some mistakes that I think that we'll talk about here lately, but we want to make sure that we reestablish and reaffirm public trust within our community in the way that we do our operations. Because, as I've said before, we are not without fault. We are humans and we will make mistakes, but how we respond to those and the things that we put in place to make sure, you know, to reduce the risk of the likelihood of that happening is what's most important. So I will introduce the assessors, and then I'll let Thurman sort of get into his part of the report. But when we asked the Chiefs Association to bring some people together, They brought Thurman, who's immediately to my right, Thurman Wisnett, who is he's a recently retired chief from Hickory PD. He brings with him 30 years of service in law enforcement, and of course, in his roles as the chief, he's overseen multiple internal investigations and personnel issues. To his right is Chris Williams. Chris is now a resident of the city of Hendersonville. He recently retired from El Monte, California, where he was a canine handler, supervised the canine program, has a lot of experience with canines. And then the third person that we had as an assessor is with Raleigh PD's, obviously not here because of the distance, but he is their master trainer and has a ton of experience with training animals and canine programs. And so the three of them together went through a lot of stuff. So I'll turn this over to Thurman so he can kind of talk about everything they've done, and then I'll come back on and talk to you about our response from the department. So, Thurman.
Thank you, Chief Mahan. Mayor, members of council, Mr. Conant, it's always a pleasure to come to Hendersonville, North Carolina. When I was the police chief in Hickory, we always had our department head retreats right around in this area. So, and there was a reason for that. It's always a pleasure to come. You guys have a beautiful city, a beautiful downtown, and a lot to be proud of. So, moving right into our findings. So just a couple things. So we started our assessment probably late February. It took quite a bit of time. It was a very extensive look into a whole bunch of records. We were going to look at canine deployments for 5 years leading up to the incident on August 2nd of 2020, and really just give a general overview of Hendersonville Police Department's canine program to date. Being an extensive evaluation, what we wanted to do was look into the history of events that may have led up to it. But the purpose was not really to be an investigation to place blame on any one individual, but more so really to just look at everything, take the findings, and kind of match that up or overlay that with what are the current standards, professional standards and best practices with regards to canine operations. And to hopefully provide some recommendations, and hopefully we've done that, provide some recommendations going forward that kind of, I think Chief Mahan, he told us his goal was to have the best, if there's a canine unit going forward, want Hendersonville Police Department to have the best canine unit, the most professional, and be the most up to standard as it possibly can be. So we were here to help with that. So just, let's see, right? Okay. So the assessment took about 3 months to conduct. As part of the assessment, we interviewed a number of HPD employees. And when I say HPD, we were HPD, so that was been a little bit confusing for me. But HPD, we interviewed a number of employees. We interviewed the O'Neills and other. We did a lot of research. We had two what I would consider subject matter experts with respect to having an extensive experience with regard to canine. My experience came more from just 30 years of operations and managing an entire police department, kind of the view from the perspective as a chief of police. And so we had more than 1,000 pages of information that were relevant to go through, training records, everything. So it took us a lot of time, but we really wanted to provide a good product to you. So the final product was around 120 pages. So looking at the findings of our report, what I'll do, obviously I think you guys have been provided a copy of the report, so tonight what I will do is just kind of hit some key points and highlights, kind of starting off with what we saw that led up to the August 2020 incidents. And we felt that they were set in motion based on a police canine program that had very little accountability for training and supervision. So if I had to say there was kind of an overarching statement, it really came back to there was just item after item that we saw that really showed that there really needed to be better structure and accountability with regard to really every aspect of the program. Some examples, the K9 Sonny, which was the K9 that was involved, when he was reassigned from his original handler, no formalized training was conducted. So, for example, with a K9 handler and a K9, when they are first paired together, there's usually at least a 12-week training period where the dog and the handler become paired together and bond. And that's also recommended at our department when we would reassign a K9. You know, that's kind of the recommended practice, that has to happen again to have that bond and that obedience that comes along with it. We learned that was not approved through some staff interviews, and so when K9 Sonny was handed off to another handler, that had not taken place. So that was kind of possibly the start of a set of events that led in motion. The training coordinator, at the time, there was a training coordinator who had been placed in that position but had no real supervisory authority to address any of the issues. And when standards were not met and correction was needed, unfortunately, the training coordinator, even after making recommendations, really, again, it goes back to there was not really any accountability or corrective action that was taken that maybe could have led to preventing this incident. One of the most significant failures that we found going back to this incident happened probably right after this incident, in that no formal administrative investigation was really conducted on the heels of this. Had that been done, you know, that could have identified areas that needed correction. Again, it leads right back to, you know, there was no accountability. And it perhaps, you know, it really gave no opportunity to follow up with Mr. and Mrs. O'Neill, who were, you know, in essence, experienced this incident. Chief Blake, who was the chief at the time, did have an initial phone conversation with Mrs. O'Neill, Mr. and Mrs. O'Neill's daughter, following the incident. But if you remember, left employment about a week later. So really, after that, there was no contact with the O'Neills beyond that point until Mr. O'Neill was contacted in 2022 by Chief Myhan. So it was just kind of, I think all of that led to some frustration at the time with the O'Neills. But I just, you know, the then chief's departure, really, it was just never picked up. Nobody really ever picked it up and followed through with it. Let's see. Okay. So going on to scope and severity of the incident, we didn't feel that the scope and severity of the incident was shared, at least to the extent of it, with city leadership. There was no real evidence that led us to believe that maybe that the extent of the injuries, you know, what had actually happened, that was relayed really up the chain. It just kind of was left untouched. So the chief of police at the time, having left employment, that probably led to the lack of communication about the incident to city leadership, and was a factor probably in the lack of follow-through with the O'Neills at the time. It was our consensus that at the time, the departmental culture under the leadership at that time, coupled with the mismanagement and the lack of accountability of the K9 unit, and the failure to conduct an investigation, in essence, we kind of described it as it kind of created the perfect storm, if you will, for what happened in the litigation. Talking about a systematic pattern of mismanagement with the K9 program preceding what led up to the August 2nd, 2020 incident, we found that over the past decade, it appeared that an inconsistent pattern of selection and purchase of police working dogs had occurred. We found that there were multiple people with varied and sometimes little experience in K9 that were heavily involved with the selection of the K9s. The K9 unit, the coordinator that I mentioned that was placed in that position, had little to no input in the K9 selections, and at the time was probably the most qualified person to actually help in making those selections. In some instances, not all, staff were allowed, and this is going back years prior to, were allowed to purchase their own canine and lease it back to the department for $1 per year. And then that officer would become a de facto canine handler with an animal that didn't belong to the department. So obviously, you know, that's not something that we would recommend. The structure, the canine supervisory structure, was not clear as we looked through everything. You know, just, again, not able to, when folks would not show up for training, no, you know, if the canine coordinator, you know, would let her superiors know, no action was ever taken. A lot of times the documentation was sketchy as to who didn't show up for training. So things of that nature, there were just a lot of things that needed correction. So talking about lack of documentation, there were failures to document training and deployment reports in a manner consistent with what is the standard practice for law enforcement agencies. It became evident in the interviews of the personnel that the training and deployment records that existed were commingled and difficult to differentiate. There was at one point, training records were kept in a certain way and in a certain file, and then it kind of changed, and some of the notes were then placed into computer-aided dispatch reports, but there was no real way, good way. It made it even difficult for us to go back and if somebody needed to go back and kind of gather all the information or to look back at the history of something, of training, even for court or for whatever, it was very difficult to do just based on how that was done at the time. And then another big one, we learned that K9 Sonny was actually allowed to remain on active patrol for a period of time after having failed certification. So, you know, that's another thing that obviously needed to be corrected. So those are just some of the highlights or the key points of our findings that we felt clearly led up to the incident and all played a role into what happened on August 2nd of 2020. So there are quite a few recommendations that we made. I don't have the final report, but I believe we divided the report into 9 different areas and had recommendations under each area, for example, training and selection and kind of, you know, just going down. So we made quite a few recommendations based on their expertise, based on best practices and what we know. Are to be best practices from a lot of the certifying agencies that are certifying canine operations. So just some of the things, you know, adopt an industry best practices and develop of a canine policy. We strongly recommend that going forward, all canines must be the property of the city of Hendersonville. There needs to be a rigorous handler selection process. Not everybody is fit to be or really has the qualities to be a canine officer. There needs to be a strong selection process, regular documented training, but the biggest thing is accountability, really just in anything. And that accountability really, you know, from my experience as a chief of police, you have to have a culture of empowerment and accountability. Employees need to feel empowered if they're placed in a role. They need to feel like that they're empowered and accountable at the same time. To take ownership. And one of the common themes just through some of our interviews that of key people, there was almost a sense of what I would describe as maybe apathy. And what I mean by that is if I'm going to recommend to my superior to hold this person accountable, you know, after a few times and that doesn't happen, you kind of become apathetic and it just, you know, so what's the use kind of thing. So that was kind of the culture that was the theme that we were hearing from prior to 2020. That was kind of what we were hearing just mostly from staff interviews. That was a common theme. So what I'll say, so I do have good news. The good news is this. So before we were even contacted to do this, I will tell you that you guys were already, the police department under the leadership of Chief Mahan, were already turning things around and headed in the right direction. And I say that because that also came out of, that was a common theme that we heard from every single person that we interviewed. I think the staff was in need of some strong leadership, some change, and more structure. And the common theme was that was already happening. So that was happening before we were called in. Credit to you, to Chief Mahan. You know, he obviously saw what the issues were, and we're here. And so kind of the analogy, I'll say the ship was kind of already turning around before we were here. So the staff were overwhelmingly positive in the direction the department is heading, not just with the canine operations, but just from a professionalism and accountability and the overall culture of the department. And culture is huge. That's something that the agency that I came from, we talked a lot about culture and core values. It was on our patch, and we just continually, in everything that we did, from our performance reviews to our disciplinary actions to our hiring to our promotions, all of those things, that culture and those core values were just something that was just injected continually. And it's clear that that's something that was already happening that Chief Mahan is doing. And that's huge, because you can have all the policies, you can have everything in writing that's all right, but if you don't have that culture and you don't have that motivation and staff that feels empowered yet accountable, then really what you have on paper, it has to work in action too. So it's more than just having the right policies. And it does appear to us, we were all in agreement that it is headed that way. And the last thing that I'll say that was very positive for us, and I think is a positive thing for you all, is our meeting with the O'Neills. We were kind of debating on, would it be worth, should we go meet with Mr. and Mrs. O'Neill? Probably one of the most positive things that we did was meet with Mr. and Mrs. O'Neill. They were a pleasure to meet with. They are supportive of the police department. They are supportive of the city, and they were very appreciative of us being there in our role. It was kind of interesting in the beginning. It took me a little bit of effort to get them to call me back, because I think they were a little bit skeptical of maybe what. And finally, Mrs. O'Neill called me back, and when we met with them, it was a pleasure. They are supportive of you guys, and they understand that this didn't have to happen. So they understand that, and I think we'll be good advocates for the department going forward, and so I will say that. And so the departmental response, I'm going to turn that back over to Chief Mahan.
Thank you, Thurman. So, Mayor and Council, that's, I think, a pretty scathing report on the condition of the police department in August of 2020. And so it's very difficult to hear. I know that y'all sitting here listening to this, and there's not a lot that we did correct on that day. But I will say that, John and I have had many conversations, Angie included. So I'll tell you our response. So it's sort of a lot of you don't know what you don't know. And I knew that there was an incident. I had what I was being told did not accurately reflect the severity of the incident. So John and I, actually during Apple Festival last year, we decided to immediately suspend all canine operations. So when I came here, we had 2 working dogs. They were both older than, I would say they were well beyond their normal service life. So we retired those dogs. It was totally unrelated to anything going on with this incident. But we were in the process in the summer of 2022 to restart our program. We had actually selected a handler. We were moving forward. We were gonna find a dog. And when this came to light, and we were digging into all the details of it, and we realized how bad this situation was, John and I both decided at this point we probably don't need to be in the canine business. So we do not have a canine program with the department right now. In fact, we use the Henderson County Sheriff's Office to do any canine operations that we need. We do that through mutual aid. We have revamped all of our policies. We do not have a canine policy right now, so we're working on restarting one. That's, of course, suspended along with our program. We do have some performance management software that we're working to really, again, try to change the culture and have better accountability of employee performance department-wide, not just specific to canines, but on all of the things that we do. So any future program, I will tell you, will be highly structured. It will be monitored. I'm not in a big hurry to have a canine program. I'll admit that to you. I think that we probably need some time to get beyond this and really think long and hard about what a future canine program would look like for our department. And that'll be conversations that John, we'll probably have several conversations about that before we do that. And of course, that would be a budget request. You'd be well aware of that before we got to that point. So additionally, my goal is that we are, if not the most transparent, but we are one of the most transparent agencies around. So we already do that with our monthly report. I report things that most of my peers would probably cringe at reporting, but I do think that there is so much about what we do that's not a secret that people want to know. And there's really not an opportunity for most people to learn, about uses of force in an agency unless the agency is willing to be open about that. So we do that. Part of us being transparent tonight, part of us asking the Chiefs Association to come in is us being transparent with people. So we, again, want to continually reinforce this improvement mindset. We talk about that a lot. Some of the things that we're doing, we have our second award through the league's Risk Reduction Review program, and that is a program that focuses on high liability areas, one of those areas being canine. So we were already in that. We just received our second review last year. We have also enrolled in the Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies and the North Carolina Law Enforcement Accreditation Program. And those are programs that are going to help us make sure that we are doing best practices within the organization and that we can prove that we are doing what our policies say. So if our policy says you have to do X, we have to have some document, a picture, some proof that shows that we actually did X. And so that's forcing us to do that. This is a departure from the way that we've done things, but I hope that this time next year we're receiving our accreditation through CALEA. And then, my commitment to you and my commitment to my boss and to the community is that we're going to maintain excellence and accountability into the future. I'll say we're working on, against performance management, accreditation, so all these things we just talked about. But, most importantly, I want to make sure that we don't repeat history, right? We need to really set some things in place. And when we do have an issue and we make a mistake, we need to not do the things that we did in this August of 2020 incident. And so I actually I told Thurman and Chris before we came over here, I went to the O'Neill's house. I just kind of wanted to see what the landscape looked like where all this happened. And Kevin O'Neill was there, and we talked for a while. He invited me to his home, and this has been long since everything's been settled, but to say that they're not traumatized by the incident is not true, but they are very appreciative that you have tasked us to do this assessment and are being so vulnerable and open about what the city is going to do to make sure that we do not repeat this and that we really improve our operations, not just in the department, but across all departments. So that is my conclusion. I'll let John add some comments, and of course, myself and Chris and Thurman are here to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Chief. I think I just want to add a couple things. It's again, Chris, Thurman, thank you for doing this. We needed this deep dive. We do want our organization to be one of continuous improvement, and it was important for us to take that internal look and, look at ourselves and where we made mistakes and where the problems lied. And so I appreciate that effort. I will say in my role, this is a tragic event and one I'm very much embarrassed about and disappointed with it even occurring. I will say we've made pretty significant improvements in the police department and will continue to make improvements. Also from the management side and the risk management side, since this incident, we have hired a risk manager, risk and safety manager who previous to this, we had the paperwork that would occur when there was a insurance claim would go through an administrative assistance here in Public Works. That's how it was set up when I arrived, and that's basically she handled the claims and worked with the insurance adjusters and things like that. After, not as a result of this, but with something that we'd been working on a number of years. But it was after this event that we hired our first risk manager and safety manager who is there day in and out looking at all risk, looking for situations where, we are, looking at safety, working directly with the insurance adjusters and the insurance adjusters and the company to make sure claims are followed up with. And he's the contact now as it relates to for folks that make a claim against the city. And that piece was not in place prior to 2020. It is again now. And is working well, and he is following up. And with Angie being here, they work very closely together to manage insurance claims. So, the fact that Chief Blake left, if that happened, or if Chief Myhan left today, if this didn't happen today, then there would be somebody who would make sure that to hold the insurance company on to task to make sure that we know and make sure we're having communication. That's the communication between the insurance company. So we've made some other changes that I think have made the organization better to deal with insurance claims going forward. Again, it's just a tragic event and something that'll live with me for a long time as it relates. But I think this report is what we needed to do, is what we needed from a staff to provide to the city council and to provide to our citizens. To show how serious we took this incident, and will continue to use it, not only in the police department, but in the entire organization as we evaluate accountability and policies and interactions. So I'll stop right there and let council ask any questions of anybody at this point.
Council, any questions or comments?
Thank you.
Okay, yeah.
That was a very thorough report.
Yeah.
Incredibly thorough report. I appreciate you putting the time and effort to write that, and the interviews, and cross-referencing the interviews in the report, and trying to give as detailed a picture as you can give. Sorry. Trying to give as detailed a picture as you can give to us, to all the different parties involved. And so we appreciate you taking time there to do that and asking some hard questions. So thank you.
Yeah. We're grateful for the time and effort that went into this to improve what we've been doing, bring us up to the highest standards, which is what we would like to see. Okay. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you very much. We're glad to have you with us this evening. Closed session. Would someone like to make that motion?
Madam Mayor, I move that City Council enter closed session pursuant to North Carolina General Statute 143-318-11A 1 and 6 to prevent the disclosure of information that is privileged or confidential pursuant to the law of this state or of the United States, or not considered a public record within the meaning of Chapter 132 of the General Statutes, and to consider the qualifications, competence, performance, character, fitness of an individual public officer or employee.
Is there any discussion? Those in favor of entering closed session say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. Ayes have it. We will enter closed session, and there will be no business to conduct following the